ILO's 169 all recognize Indigenous peoples. It gives them their free, prior, and informed consent and participation in public affairs and any initiative that could affect them and thus could affect their self-determination. The majority of these documents, unfortunately, are drafted by consultants who are hired by international organizations to respond to the needs of such institutions as the World Bank and other development institutions, but their implementation is inadequate, as the principles that they protect, namely the rights of Indigenous peoples, are hardly respected. Madam Chair, consultations must take place, and we must bolster the capacity of youth, young Indigenous peoples, so that they will be able to become true defenders of the rights of their brothers and sisters. And states should not consider Indigenous peoples to be the beneficiaries of these services, but rather partners in the development of their respective countries. I thank you.
Thank you for your intervention, Vital. I will now call upon Ecuador.
That was a greeting in the Lachtan language of Ecuador. Thank you, Chair. The proposals of social and indigenous movements on the social and political scene of Ecuador in recent years have backed the youth and indigenous peoples. Their perspective is decisive in issues linked to biodiversity, energy resources, traditional knowledge, and intellectual property. The state of Ecuador recognizes the need to implement public policies that contribute to empowering and ensuring the participation of youth in all areas of society. In this regard, we've given priority to bilingual intercultural education in territories where there is a concentration of large number of young people belonging to the 14 nationalities and 18 indigenous peoples, as well as the Afro-Ecuadorian people. Ecuador is seeking to consolidate quality education with cultural and linguistic relevance in order to develop the cognitive, psychomotor, and emotional skills and abilities of girls, boys, and youth from national peoples and through the 1,736 educational institutions that are bilingual through the bilingual intercultural educational model. This instrument is very important. It allows different perspectives to be established in order to change perceptions of education while taking into account the cultural and linguistic diversity in the country. This model pursues care for Pachamama, Mother Nature, and establishes that the key actors in the educational process are the student, their family, and their community. It gives priority to learning the native languages and of the original peoples and nationalities, with a curriculum that is focused on sustainable life as well as ancestral knowledge, culture, and practices. Through the Secretariat for Higher Education, Science and Technology and Innovation, we've implemented a program of scholarships at a national and international level. Ecuador has acquired the commitment to defend the rights of young people to self-determination, which is the right of a people to decide on their own forms of learning and government, to pursue their economic, educational, social, and cultural development in accordance with the principles of equity, which are recognized in international compacts of human rights and the Declaration of the United Nations on Indigenous Peoples. This enables comprehensive education, such as the cosmovision of all of these.
Paichani, gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias por su intervención. Now I call
Thank you for the statement.
Athabascan Council.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the context of the UNDRIP, it does not address decolonization. It is in its talks about territorial integrity, which is addressed under decolonization. We need to decolonize Alaska according to the UN Charter, Chapter 11, Article 73, which to this day has not been done. Who's supposed to vote for our future in the indigenous people, but instead who voted was the colonizers, the merchants, miners, and the military. They used statehood to say that they had decolonized Alaska, which is fraud, and is well-documented fraud. And now we need the UN to do something about it. To allow it to continue is not only criminal but complicit. Subsistence and under Section 1.2 of the ICCPR, no peoples are to be deprived of their subsistence. But the ways the laws in Alaska are, this violates regularly. A primary example is the huge trawlers. They are at the mouth of almost every river in Alaska, and almost every river has a crash in the salmon population, leading to stricter regulations on the indigenous people's right to fish, and in turn causing hunger to already impoverished people and communities as a direct result of the government regulations. They took 48,000 king salmon out of the mouth of the Yukon, but if natives get caught with one salmon, they want to find them and take their gear. We therefore recommend that the UN Permanent Forum members urge the Special Committee on Decolonization to put Alaska and Hawaii back on the list of decolonization. Chinan, thank you.
Thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Fund for the Development of the Indigenous Peoples of Latin America, FILAC. You see they are not in the room. I now give the floor to Chile.
Avanzar en la libre determinación de los pueblos indígenas.
Making progress to the self-determination of indigenous peoples and societies such as ours is part of a state commitment and a right that is enshrined in various instruments in our country, Chile, but it is also a political commitment towards a truly democratic and intercultural society that is able to build a common future based on diversity and heterogeneity under a framework of mutual respect. Recognition of this right is a central part of the political perspective of the government of the current President Gabriel Boric, which recognizes the right of indigenous peoples to freely define their own priorities and their forms of economic and cultural development in a way that is respectful of their cosmovision in all of these areas. Also, the definition of their own forms of government and to structure themselves freely without external influence and under equal conditions. Certainly, the indigenous peoples of our country have put this commitment, the commitment to this right as a fundamental demand. This question has been reflected in a growing demand for greater political representation, a question that we have borne witness to in recent years. We also know that while there is a significant gap still, and for some sectors of our society, guaranteeing the right to self-determination, that once again has been ratified by the state of Chile, can represent a break with the status quo due to the high concentration of political power. Building a truly democratic and peaceful and respectful and stable society requires recognition of the political rights of indigenous peoples and making progress towards our heterogeneous society as a source of wealth and prosperity in the future. Taking this into account, our government is deploying efforts to ensure fulfillment of the right to self-determination, and this becomes increasingly important when we take into account indigenous languages. And this represents the knowledge, culture, traditions, and cultures and ancestral values of indigenous peoples. Under the framework of the Decade for Indigenous Languages, we have gone about a national plan for indigenous languages. This seeks to support the right to self-determination and sets the self-expression of Indigenous peoples as a priority. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your statement. I now give the floor to the Confederación de las Nacionalidades Indígenas de la Amazonia Ecuadorian.
Hermanos y hermanas, soy
Brothers and sisters, I am Noya Sabacana, Vice President of the CONAIE, the Indigenous peoples of Ecuador. We have fought for decades for the recognition of our right to self-determination, to territory, and to plurinationality. We have defended our territory, which is essential for our survival against exploitation by extractive companies. We have fought for autonomy in political and cultural decisions as guaranteed by the Constitution of 2008, and we have for years demanded respect for consent for the projects that affect us in our country. Nevertheless, despite our efforts, self-determination continues to be violated by governments in turn, and that they give priority to companies instead of us. We are not criminals because we defend our own rights. We are not enemies of the state because we demand our rights. We have had enough of being criminalized for exercising our right to self-determination. The state is using false arguments that present us as enemies of development. But what type of development are they promoting? The promotion of extractive industries together with their contamination and pollution of our territories. For more than 50 years, the government of Ecuador has made us believe that extractivism was the path to development. However, indigenous peoples have seen the raw and crude truth of the extractive industries that brings about no true development without weakening our social structures and the harmony that we had with nature, which is now jeopardized. Oil and mining extraction has affected our sources in the south of our country and is endangering our territories. But we want to make something clear. Our land is not for sale. We call for respect for our territories, and our fight will be tireless. It is time for the government of Ecuador to recognize true development. It cannot be built on the destruction of the environment and the violation of indigenous rights. True development is rooted in living in harmony with nature and clean rivers and respecting the ancient wisdom of peoples. For this reason, we issue an urgent call to the international community to call on the Ecuadorian government that has recognized the plurinational state to build equitable institutions.
Muchas gracias por la intervención. Now I call on Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Chair. I am honored to take the floor here for the first time representing the Treaty for Amazonian Cooperation and to speak here at the UN. There are 50 million people that live in this Amazonian region, and many different indigenous peoples, some of which live in isolation. They have 40 indigenous languages which they use to communicate. The preservation and harmonic sustainability of the rainforest is intrinsically linked to the knowledge and wisdom of indigenous peoples. They have maintained this area as their home. It has been proven that 45% of the intact forest in the Amazon is in indigenous lands. It is therefore necessary that we affirm the indigenous and collective rights of indigenous peoples in this area and ensuring the full participation in the public policies of the countries affected. in accordance with Article 40, at the highest level, we adopted the Benin Treaty, highlighting the centrality of indigenous peoples in the sustainable development of the Amazon. This declaration of presidents of states means that they decided to establish a mechanism for dialogue and intergovernmental work together with indigenous peoples. Under this context, we invite the Permanent Forum to the expert mechanism and the special rapporteur to establish a close relationship with them so that they can collaborate with this historic initiative and the Amazonian people. I thank you.
Thank you very much for your statement. I give the floor to the forum member, Hannah.
Chair, I wish to speak about the ongoing issue of Aboriginal protection of cultural heritage and sacred lands in Australia. More than 2 years ago, senior cultural leaders in my state approached the UN Committee on the Elimination of Race Discrimination to act under the Early Warning Urgent Action Procedure in relation to the destruction of sacred lands. Since 1975, the relevant law, Aboriginal Heritage Act, had routinely allowed mining companies and developers to damage and destroy Aboriginal heritage sites, even ones as significant as Juukan Gorge, which dated back over 46,000 years and was destroyed by mining company Rio Tinto in 2020. Our matter is still unresolved, although the CERD has twice indicated to Australia that Indigenous people's rights to free, prior, informed consent have not been recognised in the law and as required by CERD. This same mining company that destroyed Juukan Gorge is now seeking to mine land sacred to the San Carlos Apache tribe, Oak Flats in Arizona. The mine is fiercely opposed by tribal councils who have also approached the UN Committee on Race Discrimination under the Early Warning Urgent Action Procedure, as their sacred lands are not being protected by the domestic laws. Following the destruction of Juukan Gorge in Australia, we had a Senate inquiry which recommended stronger national laws to protect Aboriginal heritage and ensure our sacred lands are not destroyed again in this way. Traditional owners' right to withhold consent must be recognised. An independent National Indigenous Heritage Council should have been established as a voice to the Commonwealth Government in relation to cultural heritage decisions and processes. None of this has happened. All that has been announced is a non-binding guide for business. Unenforceable protocols can't compel behaviour change from multinational corporations, and the Declaration recognises constitutional law, legislation and administrative policy as effective and binding ways of protecting Indigenous cultural heritage. In West Australia, the law still gives the Minister of the Day the rights to grant permission to destroy Aboriginal sites without the consent of the traditional owners. This is the same law responsible for the destruction of Juukan Gorge and thousands of other sites. Despite the international outrage at the actions of Rio Tinto, the federal government is still failing in its obligation to take effective measures to protect our rights to protect our cultural heritage under Article 31 of the Declaration. It is also failing to ensure that the state governments follow the principle of free, prior and informed consent before permitting the destruction of cultural heritage, contrary to the principles and obligations in Article 32 and 11. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for your statement. I now give the floor to Venezuela, Bolivarian Republic of.
O tuara por emantunda sacaran con cariña, señora presidenta.
Madam Chair, please receive a fraternal greeting from the President of our Constitutional Bolivarian Republic. In 1999, 8 years before the approval of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela recognized in its national constitution our rights as original peoples in the preamble of our Magna Carta, dedicated a specific chapter with 7 articles from 119 to 125. It is important to highlight also the incorporation into our national parliament Indigenous representatives that were selected through the assemblies of our Indigenous peoples. making this visible through inclusion in national laws and ratification of international treaties by the Venezuelan government is not just revolutionary rhetoric. It is not just about words on a page for us. It constitutes a long-term project through which a set of public policies has been developed with a view to giving concrete form to the laws, but also aimed at making indigenous peoples rights holders. Madam Chair, in Venezuelan territory, there are 44 indigenous peoples. They are organized according to our uses and customs. The state, through its governing body, the Ministry for People Power for Indigenous Peoples, is the guarantor of fulfillment of the rights of original peoples and communities by respecting their ancestral forms of organization. This is reflected in more than 4,000 indigenous communities that have their own institutions for self-governance that strengthens free self-determination. The Bolivarian government is implementing the good governance plan for indigenous people in Venezuela with the sectoral plan for indigenous peoples 2024-2025 and the programmatic agenda for indigenous peoples through 34,000 assemblies. We have given special attention to enhancing the participation of indigenous youth but above all in ensuring respect for the guarantee to sustainable development. We mustn't forget that they are calling to be key actors in climate change and can connect ancestral indigenous knowledge with modern technologies. The implementation of the plan has been disrupted deliberately in Venezuela over the last 8 years by the imposition of external factors of 930 unilateral coercive measures and criminal sanctions against our country and ancestral populations. However, we continue to move forward. This is the path that we have chosen, and we are prepared to stand up for the well-being of all.
I now give the floor to Wabanaki.
Kwai ndalewezi Sigwanis, ndalno ba esqua, nwege odanak. Bonjour, mon nom est Sigwanis.
Good morning. My name is Ms. La Chapelle, and I live in Udanak. It is with some trepidation, but above all, a great deal of pride that we speak today on behalf of our people, the Wabanaki Nation. We do so in defense of our identity and our rights as stipulated in Articles 3 and 4 of the UN DRIP, which are currently being trampled underfoot. In recent years, we have seen a significant increase in the number of people who, because of family law or a distant ancestor, declare themselves to be members of our nation. We are aware that many people who have had their status removed or family ties cut by government policies and laws now aspire to reconnect with their culture and community. Many people who belong to our nation today are descendants of people who lost their identity in such a manner. However, some of those who have lost their identity are indeed descendants of such peoples. However, there's a fundamental distinction between having a distant indigenous ancestor and belonging to indigenous people. Where still some people call themselves Abenaki without even having a single Abenaki ancestor. It's happening not far from here in the U.S. state of Vermont. The history of indigenous peoples is marked by the theft of our rights and identities, which is part of the global context of our persecution as indigenous peoples. Identity theft is a cynical ploy that perpetuates policies of assimilation. Tomorrow at our side event, we will present the case of several thousand Americans in Vermont who are stealing our identity by inventing traditions, improperly accessing funds reserved for indigenous individuals, desecrating our graves, and granting themselves the right to speak as experts about our history, violating our sovereignty and perpetuating the colonization of our people and our lands. Today, we take the floor to issue a warning to all indigenous peoples. The violation of rights that our nation suffers today could be your reality tomorrow. Indigenous identity fraud threatens the integrity of our cultures and traditions and distorts our age-old histories. Identity fraud threatens indigenous peoples' right to self-determination. It runs directly counter to our rights as set out in the UNDRIP. We must act now. As the indigenous peoples, the Permanent Forum, and all allied organizations, we must preserve and defend the rights of indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for your statement.
Maintenant, je donne la...
I now give the floor to Mexico.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
El gobierno de México
The government of Mexico, led by President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, under the principle for the good of all, primarily the poor and especially the indigenous peoples, is working to implement the right to self-determination recognized in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples under it. In this spirit, I am grateful for the presence of the National Council of Indigenous Peoples. This is a space for consultation and connection between indigenous peoples and the Mexican state in order to achieve the recognition and implementation of their collective rights, as mentioned today. In February of this year, Chair, the President of Mexico sent to the Congress of the Union an initiative for constitutional reform on the rights of indigenous peoples based on the Declaration of the United Nations and other international legal instruments. The cornerstone of this reform is the recognition of indigenous peoples as public rights holders with legal personality and their own heritage. This is a historic turning point in the Mexican Constitution because it leaves behind the colonial perspective that sees indigenous peoples as being subject to protections and ushers in a new future of self-determination. Also, fulfillment of the recommendations of this forum from April 1st to the 3rd of this year, Mexico organized the Latin American Seminar on Progress and Challenges in Implementation of the Declaration, together with the participation of indigenous experts who signed up to the Mexico-Tenochtitlan agreements under the principle of progressiveness and the evolving character of human rights. One of the agreements under this seminar was to begin the process of drafting a new international legal instrument to strengthen the principles and norms of the Declaration and to give real form to the obligations of states. We are also proposing that this could come under the framework of a convention or a treaty, and it may be part of the work to be carried out by the indigenous youth present in this room and indeed in the various regions of the world.
Gracias.
Thank you.
I now give the floor to Indigenous Peoples Organization Australia.
Madam Chair, congratulations for your election. This statement is a collective effort between Indigenous youth from Australia, Inner and Central Asia, and the elders represented in the Council of Elders. Through this intervention, our goal is to underscore the importance of nurturing and strengthening the bonds between elders and youth. By preserving this link, we ensure the endurance of our people, our wisdom, and our reverence for Mother Nature, passing them down from one generation to the next.
We, as young people, many of us have lost our way, don't know who we are dying long before we are due to enter the spiritual world, and are in need of guidance and support from our elders. We all know the impacts the settler colonial legacy has caused our people. It is imperative that we implement practices from our communities into this global community of Indigenous peoples. We have an opportunity to show the world how important our elders and our youth are for the continuation of our beautiful cultures. It is essential to honour the elders who have paved the way within the United Nations system during the times when Indigenous peoples were fighting for a place within the UN system and now have passed the power on to us. We also pay tribute to those who have passed on to another realm of existence. In this regard, we respectfully request the Permanent Forum consider adopting the following recommendations.
First, arrange a closed meeting during each session with the elders attending the permanent forum, including former members of forum and those who have historically engaged UN processes, support an elders caucus and its interaction with youth caucus. Secondly, to take action to implement recommendation of the 18th sessions 2019, whereas a permanent forum invites Indigenous elders from all over the region to establish an advisory council of leaders to assist the forum.
We advocate for the establishment of a robust system facilitating the repatriation and return of sacred objects and ancestral remains from museums and galleries to Indigenous communities and their states of origin. We recommend to funders and governments to support Indigenous-led organisations to implement their own practices of intergenerational transmission, cultural preservation, initiatives and their own development. Youth and elders walking together embodies self-determination.
Thank you. Thank you for your statement. I give the floor now to Honduras.
Señora Presidenta. Madam Chair, thank you for giving me the floor. Distinguished brothers and representatives of Indigenous peoples and representatives of states present here, it's a privilege to address you here on behalf of the Minister Carlos Cordana of the Secretary of the Ministry for Development, Social Development in Honduras. Xiomara Castro, the first woman president in the history of Honduras, has shown her commitment to the human rights and well-being of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous youth. This continues to represent a challenge because of historic structural and systematic racism that continues to limit our peoples. In Honduras, more than 17% of our population identifies as Indigenous and or Afro-descendant, 12%, including 12% of young people. These communities are pillars of our nation. Their well-being is crucial for our collective development. From Honduras, we bring a message of hope and progress, and also the renewed commitment to the principles and goals of this forum and the 2030 Agenda. We have made progress in implementing the materials that make up history, the knowledge and languages of original peoples, guaranteeing quality and relevant education for our youth, and in order to strengthen our intercultural and linguistic capabilities of teachers and in the educational community. We are doing this by generating access to opportunities, by avoiding migration and communities being abandoned. We have also created the Solidarity Grants Feliz Vasquez with a focus on protection for original peoples and Garifunas, directly benefiting youth from these communities. We are making progress in the construction of a public policy in the area of sexual and reproductive health, with a policy for care that includes intercultural health and intercultural gynecology as cross-cutting axes. We are working closely with competent bodies in order to identify and address cases of violations of rights, implementing mechanisms for effective protection. In the 18 sectors of the country, we have an interinstitutional protocol for preventing and addressing social conflict through territories and land and environmental aspects that are led by a technical bureau. We've also created 5 consultation bureaus to coordinate prior consultation under the framework of Convention 169 of the ILO, which addresses legislative and administrative aspects. We also have a national legal framework to recognize and mention original peoples of Afro-Honduran descent in the national constitution. We also have a high-level intersectoral commission for fulfilling decisions of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Through this forum, we are calling on the international community to strengthen cooperation and mutual support. Honduras reiterates its commitment to UNDRIP. I thank you
very much for your statement. Please, may I read your statement is a reasonable speed for the interpreters to allow them respect all your messages, and it's also very fast for them and to understand. And thank you so much again for your understanding. I now call on Akal El Hajer.
Madam Chair, Good afternoon. This statement is made jointly with the Indigenous Amazigh Azul Network and the Feminist Land Platform. We wish to congratulate you on your election. Madam, the right to self-determination is extremely problematic in our current Celtic because, although it is enshrined in the preamble of the UNDRIP, as well as in Articles 3 and 4, it remains denied, as are our Indigenous natures. Thus, the question arises, how can we strengthen what we have yet to fully acquire, and how can we do so when we continue to suffer from discrimination, expropriation, and the consequences of colonialist and neocolonialist laws which harm our environment and take away our liberties? We Indigenous peoples, we call for our the ownership of our territories and our cultures, knowledge, and know-how. We have noted that without the right to land, territories, and resources, as the principles are not respected, the right to self-determination was far from being ensured, and even less is it bolstered for us, Indigenous peoples and women, particularly youth, who are between a rock and a hard place, namely between incrimination and forced migration, whether it be because of climate or economic reasons. And they cannot freely ensure their economic, social, and cultural development. We have the following recommendations. States must respect the terms of the UNDRIP and not reinterpret it to for their own needs. They should stop criminalizing the defenders of self-determination. Secondly, we must work all together so that the UNDRIP becomes binding, since states do not respect their moral commitments from the adoption of this declaration, and they continue to rule over Indigenous peoples. We must also ensure that territories, lands, and natural resources of Indigenous peoples are protected as a priority so as to maintain their perennity and to allow youth and women to continue in the preservation of these lands. Thank you. Thank you very much for your statement.
The floor to Holly C.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At the outset, let me express our congratulations on your appointment, as well as our gratitude to the distinguished panelists for their contribution. The Holy See acknowledges the works of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and would like to offer some reflections on this year's priority theme. Firstly, in accordance with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People have the right to self-determination, exercised in conformity with international law, which allows them to freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. In this endeavor, it is important to recognize the role of Indigenous youth as present and future custodians of their culture. Indeed, Pope Francis has encouraged Indigenous young people to preserve their culture and roots by fighting exclusion, waste, and impoverishment in order to build a more just and human world. Take care of the roots, the Pope said, because from the roots comes the strength that will make you grow, prosper, and bear fruit. Secondly, in the cultural field, Indigenous youth often bear the cultural heritage, traditions, and languages. They can actively engage in safeguarding and revitalizing their cultural practices and contribute to preserving of their community's distinct way of life, which are integral to their right to self-determination. In the social sphere, Indigenous youth serve as bridges between generations, fostering intergenerational dialogue, understanding, and cooperation with their communities. Thirdly, Indigenous youth are also at the forefront in advocating for the protection of ancestral lands, natural resources, and ecosystems, which constitute a key component of Indigenous peoples' identity. It is important that states continue to engage in dialogue with indigenous people, including indigenous youth, to support their effort to take care of their roots for the good of the entire world, our common home. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for your intervention. Now I will call upon ACSILS. Axel?
Gusu Yochu Ganabira. My name is Riku Akamine from the Ruchu. 78 years ago today, our sacred island was bombed by American military, and thousands of our family were killed by the Japanese soldiers. And 78 years later, the same country of Japan has an international reputation as a peaceful nation, yet the Japanese government is still expanding their military, now called the Japanese Self-Defense Force, throughout our sacred island. And we are the leftovers of this battle of Okinawa. In our mother language, Uchinaguchi, we have saying, Makutu soke nan kurunaisa. If you do the right thing, then everything goes well. With this wisdom from our ancestors, we ask this Japanese government, what is peace, what is human rights, and what is courtesy? For the last 400 years, and counting since the first Japanese military invaded our island Ruchu, and Japanese military expansion is still happening, and approval for U.S. militarism over our island is given by Japan every day. With the name of Amamikyo, the name of Ushuganashi, we demand that the American and Japanese government respect the referendum from 2019 to halt construction of a new U.S. base in Sacred Ocean of Henuku, Upura, Shidaki, to stop using our ancestor remains as landfill for that new base. Case the passage of the new Japanese law that do not allow us to protect near construction sites, and to quit using our islands as staging ground for a possible war over Taiwan. Ni fayu tandiga tandi totu ganashi arigasama ryota fugarasayu and ni fe debiru. Thank you.
Thank you for your statement. I will now give the floor to New Zealand. Thank you. I will move on to Saminoro, Nora.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Distinguished experts, Indigenous siblings, this is an intervention on behalf of the Sami youth in Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Youth often get told that we are the leaders of tomorrow. We need to be where decisions are being made. We are the future. This is also our responsibility to learn our languages and cultural practices so we can bring them forward to future generations. Yesterday, the Nordic states gave an intervention explaining the good legislation they have adopted when it comes to Sami rights. They claimed that these laws would ensure that our self-determination and human rights are being strengthened. Now we expect the Nordic states to put their money where their mouth is and we urge member states to publicly hold the Nordic states accountable for their own words. Because the reality of this so-called human rights paradise is quite different. The Swedish, Finnish, and Norwegian states actively work against self-determination for Sami by overrunning autonomous democratic processes and recommending the removal of free, prior, and informed consent in intended land development projects. In fact, whenever we cross paths with state authorities, we are being minimalized and criminalized. State politicians infantilize us by saying youth voices are important, but then choosing not to listen that we have to say. Last week, the ruling against young Sami human rights defenders organizing the Fosen protest in Oslo in 2023 came. All 18 got acquitted, and the verdict emphasized the significance of the demonstration, confirming that we were right all along. Let that be proof of our will to make a change, that our words must be taken seriously, and the unbending resilience of indigenous youth. Kiitos.
Thank you for your statement. Thank you for your statement. I will now call upon Canada.
I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional territory of the Mansi Lenape on which we are gathered today. Dismantling systems of oppression, especially those that dispossess Indigenous youth from participating in their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions, is fundamental to the advancement of collective and human rights around the world. Canada is working to promote greater inclusion of youth in decision-making and in international and domestic policy fora. It has also invested in a 5-year Indigenous youth-led pilot program in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action number 66. This calls upon the federal government to provide funding for community-based youth organizations to deliver programs on reconciliation and establish a national network to share information and best practices. As one example, Indigenous Youth Roots, an Indigenous youth-led organization, is developing a national network of Indigenous youth and supporting reconciliation-focused and community-based projects. National, regional, and local First Nations, Inuit, and Métis councils, committees, and organizations ensure youth voices, including 2S LGBTQI+ youth, inform government policies, programs, and legislation. Donner plus de pouvoir aux jeunes autochtones.
Giving more power to young Indigenous peoples is important to mitigate the colonial impact. Young Indigenous peoples have reiterated the importance of protecting their languages and lands of Indigenous peoples, focusing on their health and well-being. Everywhere, Indigenous peoples call for innovative approaches to transforming our change. I wish to add that youth in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis have been able to work in the development of the national plan to implement the UNDRIP. This is work that we continue today.
We'll do more for Indigenous youth so they can meaningfully participate in the policy-making process nationally and internationally, working with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis partners organizations. I look forward to hearing more from the Indigenous representatives in states about how they are empowering Indigenous youth, and I want to thank head person Tyler George, Rebecca Lavalle, and Susie-Ann Kudluk, who unfortunately could not make it in person, for honoring us by agreeing to be part of the Canadian delegation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for your statement. Distinguished delegates, we have heard the last speaker on the item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon at 3 o'clock. Before we adjourn, I would like to invite the panelists to share their reflections on the statements made. Given the time constraints, I would ask that the reflections take 3 to 5 minutes, but preferably 3. I give the floor now to His Excellency David Choquehuanca, Vice President of the Plurinational State of Bolivia. I thank
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. There is a great deal of wisdom amongst young people, nobility, creativity, bravery, and a little bit of rebelliousness. Obligations from government, from institutions, from international organizations and the Permanent Forum. Our obligation is to give opportunities to young people, to support the youth, so that this creativity, this sense of nobility, creativity can flourish. Rebelliousness together with wisdom, resisting against abuse, resisting against the discrimination and racism, against the injustices, youth that are rebelling and pushing back against robbery and lies. The original youth of the incoming generation means that they must be brave enough to think for themselves and open themselves up to a time of change. We must not allow fear to disconnect the youth of today from their identity, to disconnect them from their noble ideas and their rebellious nature. Young people must bear in mind that knowledge and abundance are two sides of the same coin. The more they seek knowledge, the more they will find abundance. Freedom is not achieved by raising complaints nor by becoming victims. Freedom is conquered. Youth of today, do not allow your present to be robbed from you. Enjoy it. Be alive. Assume your responsibilities for tomorrow without losing your roots. A plant without roots cannot grow. A plant with no roots will not give flowers or fruits. A plant with no roots will die. Be strong and grow. Enjoy without losing your roots, without losing track of the path of respect for our Pachamama. Hayaya for the original youth.
I thank His Excellency David Choquehuanca for his statement. And out of respect for the closing reflections, I ask delegates to keep the noise down. Next, I give the floor to Professor Anaya.
Thank you. Once again, it's been a privilege to be on this distinguished panel and to witness so many eloquent statements, including those from the Indigenous youth. It is evident that the Indigenous youth of the world, and particularly those represented here, have great energy and imagination. Imagination for a time when we will see the implementation of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's encouraging to see such a broad and deep consensus on the part of those here about the right of self-determination. No one has questioned that right. It's so encouraging to see the representatives of the states to join in with Indigenous representatives or the forum members and representatives of Indigenous youth, affirming that right of self-determination and committing to its implementation. What's evident nonetheless is that we continue to see this vast implementation gap, a vast gap between what is represented in the Declaration, the model of a world in which Indigenous peoples' rights and self-determination are truly realized, and the reality that exists on the ground for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous youth. It is so encouraging to hear from Indigenous youth and their resolve to help bridge that gap. But the resolve must also come from those in power, from the governments. And those expressions of commitment to the Declaration and the right of self-determination need to be taken back to the countries and to the different ministries that have different avenues of authority over Indigenous people's rights. I've been coming to these meetings for so many years, and I've heard so much of the same. So much of the same from governments. And it's really time to see governments have the resolve to move forward to bridging this implementation gap, to talk with Indigenous peoples in a way that there can be respect for self-determination and consensus about coming to terms with the implementation of the right of self-determination. Congratulations to the youth especially. And I admire your presence here and admire your resolve. Thank you.
I thank Professor Anaya for his reflections. Thank you. Now we will hear from Ms. Gomez.
Mahalo. Mahalo nui a oko na OEV. Opio. Thank you so much. I reached out to our caucus members as well as other youth, and I congratulate all of those that were able to speak. And I know that we have a second session, and so I would kindly, as we speak about the two folks who spoke before me about accountability and action, and perhaps instead of taking up time while youth are present and have come so far and traveled and been basically ripped from their communities to be in an environment that can be very stressful for us and overwhelming for our spirits and our minds and our bodies, to perhaps instead of taking up the space and the time, let the youth speak, let Indigenous people speak in the next session, and not use your time, but listen humbly. Sit there and take in the words of all of the people who have come here, who have tried to tell us time and time again that we are the children of Earth, Mother, and we are here to be stewards, and we invite you to join us and to do the same. I want to emphasize the need for the nation leaders to protect the youth through their transparent mentorship, and nation leaders have an obligation to our ancestors to provide space for the youth to be present. We are knowledge keepers, land protectors, language carriers, and life givers who deserve to have our voices uplifted. Again, I want to say that we have another session, and I want to hear more from my brothers and sisters, my Two-Spirit and my Mahu. I would save the space the next couple of hours for our Indigenous people rather than take up the time from the UN agencies and the member states. I ask and I plead for you to give us our time and give us our respect in our own forum in the next session. I also want to echo my sister from the Pacific, from the great Moana Nui Akea, in saying, give us a seat at the table and we will give you a will for your great-great-grandchildren. And again, we are not free until we are all free. We stand against all forms of genocide, today, tomorrow, and forever. Thank you.
Thank you for your reflections, Ms. Gomez. As I mentioned, we will continue our consideration of Agenda Item 3 this afternoon in this conference room at 3 o'clock. We shall hear the remaining speakers on the list for the general discussion under this item. This meeting is currently adjourned. Thank you.